Kurt Cobain, Chris Cornell, Lane Staley, Mark Lanigan, Andrew Wood, Randy Rhoads, Dimebag Darrell, John Lennon, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison. What happened to all these people? And in some cases, we get fairly believable, credible stories. In other cases, we feel like we're not really being told the truth. So what's happening to all these people? Why are they dying? And is there some kind of Faustian bargain? Is this something to do with being famous? Is this something integral to being a rock star? Do you have to actually sell your soul to some sort of, some sort of pact? Are the powerful people behind these record companies, CBS, Columbia, EMI, Q Prime Management, are the individuals behind these entities, are they occultists who demand a blood sacrifice for Satan? I'm serious. I'm just asking the question. I'm just entertaining it for a moment. Is that true? And if it is, well, a band like Judas Priest, there must be a sacrifice in there somewhere, right? I'm a Judas Priest fan. I've been a fan of them for a long time, for most of my adult life. I don't want to believe that bands I love and people that I like are involved in stuff like that. But it's getting to the point where I don't know what other explanation makes more sense. Occam's razor states that the most likely explanation is probably the correct one. But what if you don't have a likely explanation? What if it doesn't make any sense at all? What if the simplest explanation is, they were sacrificed? It was for the Faustian bargain. They were Scott Weiland was the sacrifice for Stone Temple Pilots, Velvet Revolver, and Guns N' Roses. Randy Rhoads was the sacrifice for Ozzy Osbourne's career in Black Sabbath. Dimebag Darrell was the sacrifice for Pantera and Van Halen. Eric Carr was the sacrifice for Kiss. Now I'm making these statements just to entertain the theory. I'm not saying these are facts. I'm considering them seriously. I've just been contemplating this a lot, and I find it to be very compelling. And I'm going to talk about Judas Priest now, who their sacrifice was, who I believe their sacrifice could likely be from the perspective of this theory, which I call the Reap J. Lamb theory. And if you want to know what that is, you can go back and look at my other episodes. Look for Reap J. Lamb or R.J.L., and I'll explain it all there. Back in the 80s, there were two troubled youths. James Vance, who was age 19 at the time, and Raymond Belknap, who was aged 18. Belknap seemed to be a little more troubled than James, but they were friends, heavy metal fans, Judas Priest fans, and they would get into trouble. They dropped out of school early. They both didn't have their original fathers in their household. Their fathers both left. And James's mother belonged to a church, and they would get into it over heavy metal, and in particular Judas Priest, I suppose. And at one point, James got rid of all of his heavy metal records and, quote, came back to Christ, as his mother roughly put it. But on December 23rd, 1985, James' best friend Raymond gave him a present for his birthday, which was Judas Priest's Stained Glass album, to sort of replenish his collection and get him back into heavy metal. As the story goes, the two of them were listening to Stained Glass, and around 5 p.m. were in one of their bedrooms listening to the music and suddenly started destroying stuff and acting all crazy. They then barricaded the bedroom door from the inside, left out the window while carrying a 12-gauge shotgun with 2 shotgun shells. They went to a playground which was behind a Lutheran church that was walking distance, and they sat on one of those, or Raymond sat on one of these mechanical merry-go-round things. And Raymond sat there, put the gun underneath his jaw, and shot himself. James Vance then picked the gun up and then attempted to shoot himself, but missed and ended up shooting the front of his face off. And you can't see it too well from here, but he's pretty disfigured. And I don't want to show too much detail there because it's pretty grotesque and it's pretty hard to stomach. But there is a documentary about this called Dream Deceivers, the story behind James Vance versus Judas Priest. A film that came out in the early 90s, which I actually went to the theater and saw. And that's what introduced me to this whole topic. Now, when I'm looking at a story like this, and I'm reading about all the details and stuff, one thing that bothers me is that the very basic details are often glossed over very quickly and presented as if they're absolute fact without any dispute. Now, I'm not disputing the fact that Raymond Belknap shot himself in the head and killed himself. I'm not disputing the fact that James Vance then attempted to do the same. You can see how disfigured he is. And based on interviews, it seems pretty convincing to me that this kid saw his friend shoot his head off and attempted to shoot himself. But he does say in the video documentary that he was afraid and he didn't want to die. And his mother also called him a follower, which I think is one of the most honest assessments of James Vance that she puts out there in the video. So it seems to me that James was just following his friend. He didn't want to do it, but you know, these are kids that grew up without their biological fathers around and relied on heavy metal and the heavy metal culture a lot as a replacement for, you know, probably love and emotions that they were lacking in their family situations. So when he saw his friend die like that, shoot his own head off, it probably put him into a state of shock, maybe even a state of dissociation, which is something I talk about in my video and blog regarding Royce Robertson, where he seems to be in a dissociated state of mind and pulls a BB gun on the cops, at which point they shoot and kill him. It's all on video. And this guy was, you know, a beloved member of his community. Didn't make any sense that he did this. So, you know, it's very complicated and difficult to try and understand why these people do these things. And especially when you consider that there may be other aspects involved that we don't even know about and that we may never know about. So that's all a very difficult journey to take and difficult to unpack and try and resolve. So I'm not really going to try to do that here. What I want to do is I want to focus on this legal battle that occurred just after a few years after the incident, the James Vance versus Judas Priest case. There's this really excellent podcast I found on this topic at thewind.org, which I highly recommend you check out. It was actually only posted last year, November 7th, 2023, and it covers this topic very thoroughly. It's the most thorough thing I've found by far anywhere on this topic. And not only does it cover the documentary Dream Deceivers, he interviews people that were involved with that and people who were involved with the case and provides documents here that you can look at. So this person's done a lot of work. I highly recommend supporting what they do if you do decide to go check all this out. Anyway, so there's a letter here that actually does appear in the courtroom footage, but I didn't think much of it until I read it and saw what it actually is. So this is a letter written on, this is a letter that's dated April 1986. That would have been like 4 months after the two participated in their so-called suicide pact. So this is from the surviving kid, James Vance, the one who has the disfigured face. And he's writing a letter to the mother of his friend, whose name is, I guess, Anita, but it's actually spelled A-U-N-E-T-T-A. There's a little note there that says that he misspelled it. Now, I think it's important to remember that this kid just had his whole face basically blown off. And he's getting all kinds of surgery. You know, we're told he got $400,000 worth of surgery done on his face. He's probably on prescriptions and who knows what. You know, he dropped out of school. He dropped out of high school. So his grammar is probably not the best. He's also about, 19, 20 at this point. I think it's important to keep all that in mind when we read this because it's pretty badly written, which in one sense makes it more believable that it's an authentic letter. But of course, there's also the possibility that this was made to look real and the bad grammar was exaggerated in order to make it look more authentic. But anyhow, let's go ahead and read it here. So, Dear Anita, I just wanted to send you this picture of Ray holding a 20-inch catfish that my dad caught in Washoe Lake. He was doing some fishing of his own. That was Carol on the phone. I hope you enjoy it as much as I have. I believe that alcohol and heavy metal music, such as Judas Priest, led us or even mesmerized us into believing the answer to life was death. I'm sorry it happened, as much, if not more than anyone else. I have the negative. If you or anyone else should want more copies for the rest of the family. Sincerely, James Vance. So Ray, of course, is the kid who killed himself, James Vance's best friend and son of Anita. So he's in the picture, he's holding a catfish, and I guess Carol is the other person in the picture who's on the phone. But then he abruptly segues into his, reasoning why him and Ray went ahead and tried to kill themselves. And there's just kind of a scripted feel to it. It feels a little unnatural or something. And in fact, the guy who created this podcast and posted all this, here's what he said about this letter.
Frankly, it seems a little stilted, as if James knew what he was writing might be read by somebody other than Ray's mom.
Now, the question I have here is, if someone was coaching James Vance to write this letter, who was that person? And this gets me thinking more about Raymond as well. Was Raymond completely motivated just all on his own to go kill himself, which seems plausible from what we know about him, but that doesn't necessarily mean there wasn't someone else influencing Raymond to push him to kill himself. And again, we don't know anything about Raymond's side of the story because he's not alive. We don't have anything directly from him that we can point to. We only have, James Vance's recollections, which is the next best thing. And I don't know, I just find it a little strange here, the way I feel like someone's pushing James Vance to do this, to write this letter, someone with the obvious goal to take legal action. I suppose it could be his parents, but I don't know, his parents don't seem, I don't mean to sound insulting to them, but they seem kind of like just redneck suburb kind of ignorant people, unfortunately. And I just don't see his parents jumping on this without someone encouraging them to do so. Without someone coming along and going, hey, you can make some money here, or, you should do this because the threat of heavy metal needs to be exposed. I just feel like there's an invisible force here pushing this along and initiating this. I don't think it was just James Vance by himself. There's also the fact that the letter is so short. I mean, granted, as I said earlier, he's probably under lots of medication. Who knows what's going on in his head? The poor kid had it, blasted his whole face off. You gotta wonder about his sanity. A kid that would even do this, even before he blew his face off. The fact that he would participate in something like that, even allow himself to be encouraged to do it. So just to give you a brief idea of who we assume was sort of in charge of bringing the case against Judas Priest, this is the mother of Raymond Belknap, the kid who killed himself. And she seems, her demeanor is very strange, but it's nothing if not grim. I mean, she's obviously very distraught by what happened, and she, doesn't even attempt to hide it. I think she works at a casino at this time. She's like a card dealer or something. When she's on the stand there, she's definitely on board with, it was Judas Priest's fault. It was the satanic music. She's all on board with that. But there's also a little bit of that, again, I hate to say it, kind of redneck, a little bit ignorant, isolated suburb mentality going on here. Someone who I could easily see taking the bait, especially if they're distraught. If some slimeball comes along, maybe a lawyer, ambulance chaser type, hey, you're really upset, and you need justice here. I have an avenue for justice that you might want to consider. I could see her definitely being susceptible to that. And this is James Vance's mother, and we see a lot of her in the movie, a lot more than anyone else, really, in the documentary Dream Deceivers. And she comes off as very, I don't want to say sociopathic, but maybe borderline. She just doesn't seem to really have a lot of feelings for what's going on. And they show her in the church, and she's talking to this preacher who seems like a total kind of fake, just giving people hopium. And it's a very bad, I think, representation of Christianity. And it's kind of like the very typical stereotype that one associated with like fundamentalist white Christians in the 80s. Don't deal with problems, sweep them under the carpet kind of mentality. I don't know if this seems like the kind of woman that would be creative enough to think of a way to actually come up with a theory of how to, sue the band and blame the band for what happened to her son. These clearly weren't healthy families, for an environment for these kids. It's very believable that the kids were messed up and were capable of doing what they did. So again, I'm not here to dispute that the kids had a propensity for suicide and that they actually did what was said they did. But I don't think that means we should ignore other possibilities that may have also influenced the situation. Two things can be true at the same time. Yes, this story may be very plausible as presented, but it doesn't mean there isn't more to it that we don't know about that may have had an equal influence on the situation. So here's Timothy Post, the lawyer representing James Vance and family, speaking to James Vance about Judas Priest. And here's what he said in the interview conducted by The Wind podcast recently. Timothy Post said,
"He and his mother contacted me and said, 'Are you a Christian attorney?' And I said, 'Why, you want to sue the devil?' And they said, 'We think so.' And I said, 'Well, I don't think you're going to make it very far.' That call from the family was in 1986. They said, 'We want to sue a heavy metal satanic rock group, influencing him into trying to take his own life.'"
So I think the case was filed just a few months after this letter was written. So obviously it was the motivating factor that gave someone the idea to call a lawyer. And as you can hear, the lawyer was kind of like, you don't really have a case here. There was another lawyer representing Raymond Belknap's mother and family. And that lawyer's name is Ken McKenna. And here he is in the courtroom making the case that the kids were driven to suicide by Judas Priest, their music. And he pulls the shotgun out for effect. And it comes off as very sleazebag. Like, it comes off as very typical, like, sleazebag lawyer just saying anything he can just to try to win the case. He's laying it on real thick. But that being said, here's a quote from Ken McKenna, also from that podcast where they interviewed him too. Here's what he said.
At the time, it was apparent to me that the case was not going to be successful. The purpose in filing the case initially was to just make a point, to make public awareness, that there did seem to be a causal connection. Ozzy Osbourne's case had just been dismissed. I took the case eventually because my client talked me into it.
I don't see how the parents of these kids just got the wild idea that they could successfully sue the band or make a point or whatever, and not just lose their asses financially. I mean, think about it. Think about the finances. I mean, okay, the one mother, if she worked at a casino as a dealer, she probably made pretty decent money. Annette Robertson. But what about James Vance's mother, Phyllis? Was she loaded? I mean, she's the one who had the son with the disfigured face. And the figure given here is that a good $400,000 were paid just in surgeries and stuff for the kid. And I doubt insurance covered all that. And on top of that, you want to hire, these lawyers. Lawyers are expensive and they don't work for charity. The lawyers aren't going to work for free. I know in some situations a lawyer might say, we don't get paid unless we win your case, but I kind of doubt that was the case here. So, and in the judge's notes, he even remarks.
Another significant obstacle faced by the plaintiff's attorneys was that of money. Operating virtually without resources, plaintiff's counsel have challenged two major corporations in a very technical field.
So I think he's talking about Judas Priest, the band, and CBS Records, the ones who represented them. So, I mean, CBS Records is a huge corporation. This just doesn't make sense from a financial standpoint. And if you're going to take the view that they're doing it just to prove a point, I mean, that's shaky as well. So when the case was initially brought, the song Hero's End was singled out from the album Stained Class as an example of what drove the kids to suicide, which has a line, "Why do you have to die to be a hero?" And I can very clearly remember the first time when I really got into this album, and I understood very clearly, at least in my mind, I interpreted it as it's a shame. Like, people shouldn't have to die to be a hero. I didn't get the impression at all that it was promoting dying to be a hero. The plaintiffs kind of laid off that, and then at some point made the subliminal message thing their main thing that they were pushing, which was basically that the song Better By You, Better Than Me contained the message, do it, just do it, or something like that, which is weird because it makes you think of Nike, right? Just do it, just do what? It could mean anything, right? But in context with the album cover, which kind of looks like it has someone with like a bullet going through their head, right? I always thought it just looked cool. I thought it looked like Destro from G.I. Joe. Destro was my favorite action figure when I was a kid. So, but I guess when you think about it, it's a metalhead, isn't it? Pretty ahead of its time for 1978. But it just makes you wonder, did they just sort of choose this album to blame? And that's why I really like the investigative report, so I can figure out how they determined exactly that this is the album that was playing on the record player in the kids' room before they left the house. I mean, that's the kind of fact that, how do we actually know that's true? I mean, did one of the parents actually find the record playing in the room? Or was that, and was that just made up? If you can't disprove something, you can't rule it out. Anyway, in the end, the judge determined that the word "do it" was in there. And when you listen to it, you can hear it. It's kind of weird, actually. It does sound like they're saying "do it" in between every line in the chorus. But the judge also determined that these sounds were accidental, that they weren't necessarily on purpose, or if they were, it couldn't be proven. But what's interesting about that song, Better By You, Better Than Me, is that it was a last-minute addition to the album. When CBS Records insisted on including something with commercial potential to liven up an album they felt had a very dark and sinister tone. The song was recorded with producer James Guthrie separately from the rest of the album, as McKay, I guess that was the original producer of the rest of the album, had moved on to other projects and was no longer available. So it is kind of strange that the one song they pick is one that was added at the last minute. And what doesn't make sense to me at all here is that, I can remember very clearly being, a teenager and listening to this album, and Better By You, Better Than Me was, to me, the darkest song on the album, except for maybe Beyond the Realms of Death. I think it's a very dark song, very tragic sounding. And it's a cover by Spooky Tooth. Now, in the 70s, there was, some music that we might perceive as a little darker or melancholy could be commercially successful. I guess you got to take it into context with, the sensibility of the time. But again, if they wanted to liven up the atmosphere, I think there's a lot better songs they could have picked that would have been a lot more appropriate. The other interesting fact is that James Guthrie would go on to work with Pink Floyd on The Wall, and which would require, some very high-end engineering skills, which tells me James Guthrie was a very skilled person. He wasn't just anyone that, pulled out of the ether to save money. Point being, he's someone that could probably manage to put on subliminal messages that they claim were on there. It is mentioned in the court documents that the sophistication required to accomplish the sounds at the time, 1978, that was in question. So it's just an interesting coincidence that what I assume to be a very competent engineer gets pulled in last minute for this particular song. I took some time and put all of what I believe to be relevant information into a timeline just to see what would yield. And this is what I have here. So February 10th, 1978, Stained Class was released. Then we go up to 1985, which is when the two boys, had their suicide pact. A couple things that same year happened with Judas Priest that are worth noting. Apparently they went on their first hiatus that they pretty much ever went on since they started performing in the 70s. And Rob Halford actually had a suicide attempt, which he talks about in his book. He drank a bunch of Jack Daniels and he tried to swallow a bunch of sleeping pills. This is what he says motivated him to get clean. Now, this next fact, the time is a little bit hard for me to discern, but Halford's romantic partner around that time also attempted and successfully committed suicide. This is an individual he calls Brad in the book. He says he changed some of the names to protect the identities of the real people, but I found somewhere where it was stated that this occurred in 1985. I think that was on Wikipedia. Although in his book, it kind of sounds like it might have happened in 1986. But think about that, okay? What are the odds of these two kids, killing themselves or attempting to kill themselves, and Rob Halford attempting to kill himself the same year, and his partner actually killing himself all in the same year? It's kind of spooky timing. Did Halford have other reasons to be extremely upset that year that maybe we don't know about? Did he perhaps know that these kids committed suicide or were going to attempt to commit suicide, and that there was some kind of connection to the band that he knew about? I know some people might be going, oh, come on, man, but hey, I'm just throwing it out there, okay? Not saying it's fact. It's something that occurred to me. Because a lot of these books, when they come out, the purpose of them is to, perhaps set the record straight, but also to promote certain narratives that, whoever wants promoted. Because the publisher of Rob Halford's book is Haché, and that's the same publisher that put out Mark Lanigan's book, Sing Backwards and Weep, which, if you look into it, you will see that Haché, there are connections there to Lagardère Group, who are owned or partially owned by Qatar. Qatar funds the Muslim Brotherhood. So, these are connections I've made in the past from other blogs that you may remember that I touched on. So I know that's a lot of information there to digest, but I'm making connections here and throwing possibilities out there. March 21st, 1986, Turbo is released, the album Turbo. In spring of 1986, a woman named Mrs. Rusk claimed that James Vance told her, "We got the message. It told us to just do it." Now, the reason this is significant is because Miss Rusk is saying that James told this to her before they began scrutinizing the song Better by You, Better Than Me, and took the whole do it angle in the case. So if Miss Rusk is telling the truth, this indicates that the Just Do It message allegedly delivered by the album had more credibility than may have otherwise been determined on the surface. Now, of course, Miss Rusk could have just made this up, so we don't really know. April 1986, letter from James Vance to Ray Belknap's mom. July 10th, 1986, the case was filed. So that was 3 months after the letter that we were talking about earlier made the light of day. So it seems clear again that the letter was the initial motivation for the case being filed. May 13th, 1988, Ram It Down is released. So I assume the band knows about that this case was filed. It took a few years for it to actually occur in court, which was 1990. But I assume the band must have known about it as they were releasing Ram It Down. November 1988, James Vance lapses into a coma on Thanksgiving Day, dies 6 days later. So James Vance, this kid right here, the disfigured kid, he actually died before the court hearing finally occurred. So think about this for a minute. 1986, the initial documents were filed against Judas Priest and their and CBS Records. But it wasn't until 1990 that the trials actually began. So that's like a 3-year gap. And in that time, just a little over a year before the trials began, James Vance dies. So then I thought to myself, well, that's kind of weird timing. Was James Vance murdered because someone didn't want him to take the stand? It's a reasonable question. Why not look into it? Now, David Van Taylor was the director of Dream Deceivers, and according to him, he said, I was there for the whole thing, meaning he was there to capture, this whole story that we're talking about. I assume the footage of James Vance that we see, the heartbreaking footage of him disfigured, was taken by this director and his camera crew. So he was clearly there over a year, probably a couple of years before the trials even began. So I think it would be interesting to know, how he had the funding to do all that and take so much time. I mean, it's one thing to say, okay, the trials are about to begin, I'm going to cover the trials. But he's not doing that. He's going back a year or two earlier, and he's interviewing the families and everyone involved, and then also the trials. So he spent a few years doing this. I mean, I don't know who this guy is, but he seemed to be pretty well funded. Was the purpose of this documentary really to help make sure that the perception by the public, geared a certain way and not another? There was an article in the LA Times that is dated August 7th, 1990, which reads, Vance, horribly disfigured, survived 3 years of excruciating pain and experimental plastic surgery before lapsing into an unexplained coma on Thanksgiving Day, 1988. He died 6 days later, 4 years ago from the time the article came out. Attorneys for the families filed a product liability lawsuit against Judas Priest and CBS Records, the band's record company, seeking a minimum of $3.6 million in damages to compensate for their deaths, medical bills, and support for a child Vance fathered after the suicide attempt. So there we go. There's some motivation for the case to be filed. Hey, $3.6 million, that's a lot of money. And this thing about Vance fathering a child after the suicide attempt kind of states that he had a reason to live. So what's going on with this unexplained coma? How did that happen? Wikipedia states that Vance was left critically injured after surviving a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the face, eventually dying of a methadone overdose 3 years later. So there we go, methadone. Now Rob Halford says the same thing in his book, almost exactly that line, that he died from a methadone overdose. One of the most thorough articles I found was actually on a site called UPI.com. Now, I guess UPI used to be a competitor to Associated Press, so that it's a reputable establishment. And here's an interesting quote from that article. Vance had entered the hospital for treatment of depression earlier this month. He lapsed into a coma last week after taking the pain-killing drug methadone. James did not commit suicide, the lawyer said. I'm not going to comment how I know that. We do not know the cause of the seizure in the therapy ward which caused him to go on the life support system. We did not pull the plug on it. He said Washoe Medical Center has been evasive in giving out details surrounding the incident. An autopsy was conducted Wednesday, but it will be 2 or 3 weeks before the cause of death is known. And I couldn't find any articles revealing what that cause of death was. So it seems to me something weird happened in the hospital surrounding the death of James Vance. How come more people weren't concerned about that? if he was murdered, that opens up a whole new can of worms. Who would murder him and why? I would like the investigative report. I looked into that a little bit, but some of these counties are requiring ID now, and I'm just not comfortable with that. So I didn't really proceed to try. Not that I would have been able to get the report anyway, but because so much time has passed. Also, when someone dies in a hospital, that makes it more difficult. A hospital death, then it only goes to the next of kin or someone connected to the person. It's not as easy as if they die in a public place where you can just order as a public record. So that makes me think of Andrew Wood. Andrew Wood died in a hospital. So even if I had filed for a Freedom of Information Act request in, say, 1995, I may not even have been able to get it back then due to the fact that it was that he died in a hospital. Of course, as I said in a previous video, after so many years, they destroy records. So again, we've got a Wikipedia entry with no source cited, which is weird because they usually put these little numbers to give you the source. That's why they do that. That states James Vance died from a methadone overdose. There are other entries regarding this incident in Wikipedia where that is not mentioned, and it's saying that he died of unknown causes. We've got a UPI article that states James Vance died from a methadone overdose. We have the lawyer stating in that same article that it was not suicide. Well, then what does that mean? It means somebody administered it to him. Now, whether that was intentional or not is up for debate, but murder is on the table here. You know, if these parents are so concerned about their kids that they're willing to go after Judas Priest and some abstract legal theory, what about this thing right here? This is a lot more in your face. Is, you know, hey, this hospital killed my son. What am I going to do about it? Am I going to take them to court? I might win millions of dollars. And finally, we have Rob Halford in his own book stating that James Vance died from a methadone overdose. So now, what is methadone? Well, you know, I've known it most of my life as a drug people take to help them get off of, that's prescribed to help them get off of heroin. Which is kind of weird. I never quite understood that because then they just get addicted to methadone because it's an opiate. But if we look at the Wikipedia entry, we see that it is a synthetic opioid agonist used for chronic pain and also for opioid use disorder. So you notice chronic pain is listed first. In other words, it's a painkiller. Now, the album Painkiller by Judas Priest was recorded just before the trials began in 1990. And in fact, the release of the album was supposedly delayed because of the trials. So the timing is kind of interesting there. According to Wikipedia, despite the album being finished in March 1990, the album's release was delayed due to the pending, much publicized subliminal message trial that began on 16 July 1990. The band was the subject of a civil lawsuit alleging their recording was responsible for the suicide attempts of two young men in Reno. The case was eventually dismissed on 24 August 1990. With the trial behind them, the band finally released the album on 14 September 1990 on LP, cassette, and CD. So the album was released just 1 month after the trial concluded. Also, according to Wikipedia, 3 weeks after the lawsuit wrapped up, the band kicked off their Painkiller tour by playing Better By You Better Than Me on the first concert in Burbank, California on 13 September. It is Judas Priest's only live performance of the song since 1979. So Judas Priest was obviously wanting to make a point by playing the song that they just got done having a whole court case about, saying that it encouraged these kids to commit suicide. They chose to play that song on their very first show, having not played it since 1979. Part of me says, well, good for them. They're basically saying, fuck you, we'll play whatever song we want. It's not hurting anybody, and we're proud of the song. And, you know, that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is, and wouldn't you be a bit paranoid? Wouldn't you be like, maybe let's just stay away from that song? I mean, they weren't playing it anyway for years. So it seems rather obvious that it was pulled out of the archives specifically because it was the center of attention in this court case. You know, it could almost be perceived as, you know, haha, we got away with it. Now here's the song in your face. You know, if you want to take that extreme perspective on the situation. I can still very clearly remember the first time I heard the song Painkiller when it came out, the video on MTV, and it was shocking. It was shockingly badass. Like, everyone I knew who was a Judas Priest fan, we all just couldn't believe that these old guys came out and just so powerful and just way heavier than they've ever been, as far as we were concerned. But I have to admit, I never understood what the hell the song was about. I mean, obviously it's about a painkiller, but the way they're using the word painkiller is they're obviously putting their own definition on it. And as far as we were concerned, me and my friends, it just meant badass. That's all it meant, The first definition of painkiller, as you can see here, is an agent such as an analgesic drug that relieves pain. That's the first meaning. It's a medical term. So I think you know where I'm going, but let's just look at the lyrics, okay? And I can't tell you how many times I've looked at these lyrics and been like, what in the hell is he talking about? I mean, it's this amazing man machine or something that comes out of the sky and comes to save mankind from something, and almost like in a manner of like revelation at the end of the Bible. But if you look at the first line, faster than a bullet. All right, so let's just cut to the chase here, okay? James Vance tried to kill himself with a bullet, and the painkiller is faster than a bullet. Well, what killed James Vance? A painkiller. So they're telling you right in the first line. I mean, unless someone can explain to me why this is so coincidentally perfect to describe the manner in which James Vance died in the hospital. I mean, your first thing that you put out after the trial, given that James Vance died in, I think it was 1988 or maybe early 1989 at the latest, there was certainly enough time for some sick person to decide to write these lyrics in reference to that. So let me tell you the metaphors that I see here, okay? I think the painkiller is the band. It's a metaphor for the band. And look, the angel on the bike, that's Rob Halford. He comes out on the demonic mechanical motorcycle. He's half man, half machine. He is the painkiller. It's a male. This is the pain. Make sure that you know what the painkiller is. Rides a metal monster. Now, for a second, I thought maybe this could be a reference to the metal merry-go-round that the dudes were sitting on when they decided to blow their heads off. Breathing smoke and fire, that's a motorcycle. Closing with vengeance. I mean, I don't know that it's a motorcycle, but I'm saying I think the metaphor fits there. And then it's all epic. Planet's devastated, mankind's on its knees. It gets a little more fantastic. So, from the perspective of the Reap J. Lamb theory, the band needs a sacrifice. It's time for a sacrifice. And so, in 1985, who's going to go? Who's going to be the sacrifice? Well, the savior that comes from out of the skies is the sacrificial lamb, the kids. Answer to their pleas. The band's like, please, send us a sacrifice so one of us doesn't have to do it. Faster than a laser bullet. What's this thing here? Is that a laser bullet? I mean, that's the best. I never knew what the hell that, I know I'm kind of jumping around here, but I've never heard a better description of what that is than a laser bullet. The bullet didn't kill James Vance, but the painkiller did, because it's faster than the bullet. In other words, it did the job better than the bullet, ultimately. With mankind resurrected forever to survive. Is this referring to the, sort of the metaphorical resurrection of Judas Priest after their sacrifice? And is this where the fury and the power from the album really comes from? I know this all sounds really extreme and absurd what I'm suggesting here. And, again, I say this all the time. I don't know that what I'm telling you is the truth. I'm just entertaining the thought, and I'm just seeing things fit together in this really creepily weird way. And as far as I'm concerned, this is the most logical explanation for what Painkiller is about that I've ever heard. Of course, I'm a little biased because I'm agreeing with myself, right? But, tell me what you think. Does this just all sound completely crazy to you, or is some of this making sense? So to kind of wrap this up, I think regardless of what how you feel about the things I've been suggesting, the theories I've been putting forth, the possibilities. I think we can all agree that this case that was brought against the band was completely absurd and kind of didn't make any sense. I mean, who stood to gain from it? CBS Records had to pay, I think it was $40,000 to the court for dragging their feet on submitting master tapes of Stained Class. Not to mention all the other fees they had to pay for lawyers and such. The plaintiffs, had no hope of winning. They were told so by two lawyers. And we're supposed to believe that the reason they persevered was, to raise concerns and to raise awareness about, satanic music in society. I don't buy that for a second. I don't think the parents, and I know it's easy to say from where I'm sitting, I don't mean to judge people that are deceased because I think both of the mothers are deceased now, but, especially Phyllis, she just does not come off as a good person at all. She's had all these marriages and, she comes off as very condescending and just a total bitch, heartless. At the funeral, she doesn't seem to have any emotion at all. So it's kind of no wonder that what happened to these kids. It's a very believable, compelling story. I'm not even necessarily denying the narrative that as it is. I'm not necessarily denying that. But see, two things can be true at the same time. I think that these kids were used, whether it was contrived by the evil occultists behind the entertainment industry or not. I think ultimately they were used as sacrificial lambs. It's perfect if you think about it. If you're Satan, okay, pretend Satan exists, and you love people sacrificing to you, you're looking at a double suicide sacrifice in the name of, the name of the music, which we're led to believe is the music of the devil, right? According to the Reap J. Lamb theory, a very strong connection needs to be made to the band. And that's what this court case accomplishes. It sensationalized it, made big headlines for days, months, and years. To this day, people are still watching the documentary. And I think that's the kind of impact that needs to happen in order for the sacrifice to be accepted by whoever. The Dark One. Because if these kids had merely done this and there was just maybe a story about it and then it was over, that would have been it. But this court case really blew it up and turned it into something else. And when you take into account, the mysterious death of James Vance, that kind of advanced it as well into a possible double suicide or even a homicide on top of that. And, I want to believe Rob Halford is a really good guy. I read his book. He comes off as a very good man. He comes off exactly as I would have expected him to come off. Not perfect, but I just don't think we can ever really know these people because it's really easy for people to get on board with the idea that the entertainment business is evil. But it's a lot harder for us to accept the fact that people we love and admire, are connected to that evil industry, and they may not be these people that we think they are. Or they may be very good people that just made a poor choice at various points in their lives. And, I'm not trying to put myself or anyone else above them. I probably would have, maybe I would have done the same thing had I been offered a Faustian bargain way back when. Who hasn't dreamed of being a rock star at one point in their life, and who wouldn't say yes when offered the deal? But I guess the question is, would we understand the fine print and would we go along anyway?